Welcome back, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Rachel Sampson, and I am the Vice President of Research at the IRPP. So I want to dive right in, because I know everyone's anxious to get to the reception, and we also have, I think we have a special guest that's coming to close out the day. So we're very fortunate to have the other half of our steering group that has guided us through this initiative for the past 2 years. We have Emna Braham. Emna is the CEO of the l'Institut du Québec, which is a nonprofit organization that undertakes policy research on economic issues in Quebec. Emna has been with l'Institut du Québec in various roles for 5 years and was previously a senior economist at the Labour Market Information Council. And then we have Jim Stanford. Jim is an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. And Jim is one of Canada's best-known economists, serving for more than 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union. Jim is also the author of a number of articles and books, including Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism. And finally, we have Glenn Hodgson. Glenn has more than 40 years of experience in global macroeconomics, international finance, fiscal policy, and climate policy. Glenn's career has spanned time at the Canadian Department of Finance, the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., Export Development Canada, and the Conference Board of Canada, where he was Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for more than a decade. His current affiliations include Chief Economist with Momentous Global and Senior Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. So our goal with this panel is to highlight key insights and takeaways from the day, and to provide a sense of next steps. So at the end of this panel, we're going to have some time for questions before we have our closing remarks from a special guest, and then head to the reception. So Jim, I'm going to start with you. We talked a lot about industrial policy today, so I want to start with what you heard today in terms of ideas for industrial policy.
Right, thank you, Rachel, and thank you and your team at the IRPP for this whole project. 2 years of slogging away, and this day and this report were a great culmination of it. My big takeaway, I think, from today, but frankly from the whole project as well, isn't so much that there's one particular insight or one particular clever policy that will really work in industrial policy applications. I do think industrial policy is inherently diverse. It has to apply to different sectors, different situations, different technologies. So it would be a mistake to think that we can do it with one sort of magic bullet. I think my takeaway is that industrial policy is a way of thinking. A way of approaching problems about economic structure, technological progress, global competitiveness. I do think that through this whole process, we've got past, finally, debating whether industrial policy is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether we should be doing it. I know there's certain columnists at the National Post who are still having that debate, but not most of us. And our research showed through this project that Canada's always done industrial policy. It's just a natural, permanent feature of our policy landscape. We even do it in ways that we don't recognize. Bitumen production, a clear result of industrial policy. The way our financial and banking system works clearly reflects industrial policy decisions, our telecommunications sector, et cetera. It's not just autos and steel and the traditional targets. We've also learned that other countries do it all the time, including ones that pretend not to do it, but throw gigantic subsidies at it for defense reasons or energy reasons, or at least Donald Trump is honest about what he's doing and not trying to pretend it anymore. I think the question becomes, how are we doing industrial policy and how can we do it better? So we should refine the tools that are in our toolbox about industrial policy and improve them, make them more efficient, learn from other countries' experiences what works and what doesn't. I think we have to enrich our capacity, including in government, to conduct industrial policy effectively. Our governments need to have an independent ability to deeply understand the sectors that make up our economy, to come to their own kind of independent and rigorous judgments about how those sectors are working and what they need, not just rely on, companies knocking on their door telling them what they need, but an ability to discern what's actually at stake from the sort of rent seeking that would go on, and just become more confident and in a way competent at industrial policy and make it a sort of a normal, legitimate feature, a core feature of making our policy. In that regard, I think this whole project, Rachel, has served a very useful purpose to make this, just part of what is normally out there. Now let's learn how, as Canadians, we can do it better.
Great. We also heard about industrial policy, a lot of other things people mentioned, skills, infrastructure, other things that help make industrial policy successful. Can you speak a little bit about some of the things you heard about other aspects that are needed for an industrial strategy?
Maybe at the foundation of industrial policy, there's economic policy, which is mainly making sure, as Chris Reagan mentioned this morning, that we have the context, the baseline for economic growth. So good infrastructure is obviously one of them. I would say the challenge right now is that, as Jennifer mentioned a bit later, now greater fiscal discipline is expected in the next few years. So the challenge is going to be to be strategic, to prioritize projects. And we've heard a lot about energy, about housing, but I heard a lot today about transportation infrastructure, as Matthew Holmes mentioned. And there's a great report from the Conference Board a few months earlier about lack of productivity in transport. So that's one of the challenges that we will have. But maybe I will add also one of the challenges is going to be to maintain the existing infrastructure and adapt it, especially in a context where we're going to have greater climate change. Premier Simpson told us a great tale about that, but it's going to be more expensive to build infrastructure, and they will last less time. So it's going to be a challenge also to make sure that we have new infrastructure, but that we also that we're maintaining our existing infrastructure. And the federal government, as a main funder for infra, probably has a role in terms of money, but also in terms of signaling and giving predictability. Because what we need is for the industry, the construction industry, to hear the signals that there will be demand, and there will be demand for a few years, so it's worth keeping my people, it's worth investing in capital, integrating new technology. So I think infra is obviously one of the challenge. For skills, the federal government is sharing responsibilities with provinces, but obviously immigration policy, we haven't heard a lot about it, but it's going to be a key challenge. Finding innovative, disruptive research in academia is going to be another one. And I think one of my concerns is we might have missed the window of opportunity to attract those talents from the US. And as Noah mentioned early in the morning, but also one piece that we shouldn't forget is also the way to attract people is, yes, through immigration, yes, through labs, but also having livable, cool cities where cool people want to hang out and date. And so I think that's also the interconnection between industrial policy, but also more social policies and making sure that our cities are fun and cool.
That's great.
She's from Montreal.
Yes, well, Montreal is pretty fun and cool.
Rub it in.
Glenn, I've had a number of people say to me that this conference is really timely in the moment we're in. Can you say a little bit about the context of today and how is it different today than it has been in the past in terms of talking about industrial policy?
When we started this out, 2.5 years ago, I think we had the first conversation. We were really looking at kind of fine-tuning or almost a review of the current system. And then we've been shocked by a series of events that make it much more fundamental. I mean, we've been hit by the loss, by Trump tariff policy, in fact, Trump economic policy, which is kind of threatening both our sovereignty and our capacity to create wealth in this country. So that was shock number one. We've been shocked by security events. You know, the Russians are now conducting a war in Ukraine. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran forming an opposition potentially. So there's a real need to rethink our military positioning. Climate change is reality. I mean, we can see the cost of climate change rising. So our ability to actually transition to a low carbon economy has to continue, and we have to kind of figure out our supporting industrial capacity for that transition. A whole variety of other issues. And then we have opportunities. We have more and more new Canadians coming in. We've got to find a way to make sure that they're welcome and integrated into our economy. And then the big Indigenous question. And I've had a chance to do some research actually recently on Indigenous financing. I'd like to talk about that a bit later. But I think we have kind of a golden opportunity when it comes to ensuring that reconciliation actually happens and we have all the right tools in place. And I just sat in a very good panel discussion on that topic. So what looked like kind of a nice to do has become a must do over the last 2.5 years, and this could not be more timely.
Great. Well, like me, I think many people here wanted to be in more than one breakout session. So you three were spread across the sessions. So keeping in mind the Chatham House rule of the sessions, I just want from each of you a sense of some of the highlights, the ideas that came from those sessions. So Emna, you were in the housing and artificial intelligence sessions, I believe. So what did you hear?
The housing session was really interesting because it really highlighted a paradox that we're living in Canada, which is we need to build more to be more productive, because we need to attract those smart people in those cities, and we need to attract workers in near factories. So we need to build more houses, but at the same time we have to be more productive in building those houses. And it's not a Canadian challenge, it's a global challenge. We heard most OECDs are seeing their construction productivity stagnating or even declining in the next few decades. So rules are becoming more complicated, our houses are more sophisticated, they're probably better quality, but all that hasn't been compensated by innovation, technology, and productivity gain like we've seen in manufacturing. So it's a great challenge, and one of the idea that is really pushed forward right now is making construction like manufacturing, so modular construction, prefab, and we've heard a lot about the opportunities that it provides, but also some of the challenges in terms of scalability, making sure that we have standardized projects in order to actually put them in scale and being able to replicate them in different municipalities, making sure that the regulation and norms are also accepting of this new approach. So it was really interesting because we've heard about what it could do, but also maybe what we have to, the obstacles that we have to remove.
Right. Glenn, we'll go to you next. I think you were in the Indigenous economy and defense sessions, right?
And I took notes on my phone like one of the kids. So, and I'm actually shocked that you came up with a hard copy notes. I mean, voyons.
That's cool too.
Okay. So yes, I was in Indigenous and defense. And now I have to get my notes back up.
That's why hard copy's better.
Okay, so Chatham House rules in both cases. So, and you're right, Chatham House rules it means I can't identify a speaker, but I'll speak to the big themes. I think the first and most important theme was rebuilding trust. One speaker said that we've been working to destroy trust with the Indigenous community for 200 years. So we're probably not going to have 200 years to rebuild it, but we have to clearly start that as a fundamental point. I think past governments have actually reached out and tried very hard. It's an incomplete story. I mean, Bill C5 may not be a step in the right direction, although I think the Prime Minister is now scrambling very hard to ensure that there's proper degrees of engagement. But the rebuilding trust piece is really important. Second was people, and we've had other discussions early this morning about human capital, for example, in the north, and the fact that if you're going to have northern economic development, the workforce is going to be Northerners, and therefore they need the education, skills, training to actually be an effective workforce. One of the pieces of data I came across in my own research is that the graduation rate from high school for Indigenous kids has really gone up. It's up to between 70 and 80% in most cases. It was as low as 50% 20 years ago. So that's a good step in the right direction, but we clearly have to invest in our post-secondary education, universities, schools, and other institutions to actually have the skills. And Jim, on-the-job work is also an important part of building skills. Thirdly, not one size fits all. There is 630 Indigenous communities in Canada, and they're all in different places. There is actually some wealthy ones, there's a lot of poor ones. So you can't apply kind of one tool to all the cases. You really have to use judgment and about how to integrate them into the modern economy. Next was financing. That's kind of a bugbear for me. I've personally spent a lot of time thinking about how to mobilize financing. And I will mention the Indigenous Development Bank idea. We had some discussion of that. The loan guarantee programs that are in place federally, provincially, I think are a really important step in the right direction. I understand Ontario's doing some useful things as well, but I think we're now at a point where we need to take the next big step. And I didn't say this in the meeting because it would be kind of stealing the agenda, but the research that I had a chance to do with the team a couple of years ago on how to create an Indigenous Development Bank would be a really important step forward. I know there was efforts to try and sell this in town before the last Trudeau budget. Hopefully there'll be a chance to get into the next budget as a way to move forward. So those are some of the themes that we covered.
And what about the defense session?
Oh, on the defense side, I went there. I don't have a high knowledge base on defense, so I went there in kind of learning mode. And can I spend a second getting my notes back?
Of course. Please do.
So this is why I use hard copy, right? Don't laugh. Sois gentil. Hein? Okay, the themes in defense, the moderator, I think, made a great start talking about a new global risk framework, the fact that we really are in a different situation with the obvious threats we're facing from China, from Russia, and from others. Secondly, we talked about defense now being a tech war. We're using more and more advanced technology. Although in the course of the discussion, we had a discussion about the need for both conventional military capacity as well as sort of modern AI or technology-driven capacity, which was interesting. Arguably, we're already in a Cold War. We're in a Cold War, which is cyber, which is going to morph into use of AI. So we have to be very much aware that the rules of the game have already changed. And then implementation becomes a key issue, and it's certainly a key issue for the Canadian Armed Forces. And then we had long discussion about what must be produced in Canada, actually taking some hard decisions. I'm old enough to have been involved in ship financing way back. I was kind of aghast to learn that we allowed a lot of our capacity to wither away. So simply rebuilding existing capacity in maritime, in munitions, before we get into anything sexy, is a really important place to start. Of course, the ongoing bugbear of air defense and what sort of capacity we have there. So it was a very, very rich conversation. I probably can't do it all justice here. But I think whatever notes emerge from that will be really useful for a wider population.
Yeah, we took lots of notes, so.
And that's a good practice.
Jim, you were in the Interprovincial Trade and Decarbonizing Industry session.
Right. Okay. So the Interprovincial Trade Panel, it focused almost exclusively, Rachel, on the task of reducing regulatory barriers or regulatory differences between the provinces. Some of those regulatory differences are big, like mobility of regulated occupations between provinces. Some of them, frankly, are trivial, like, lovely things about how you have different specifications for a high-vis safety vest, or some of the composition of a first aid kit, or dare I say, wine and beer restrictions, okay? If you were from another planet or another country and you came to Canada and you listened to the discussions about interprovincial trade, you would conclude we were a nation of alcoholics, because the only thing that comes up is, well, I can't sell wine and beer in another province. And it isn't that we're actually a nation of alcoholics. It's that nobody can think of another truly tangible barrier to trade between provinces. And this is why it keeps coming up. And there's a lesson in this. So, you know, we got good frontline reports from some of the people at the tables on how it's going to negotiate these differences, and the government officials at all levels and business advocates and so on will carry on that work. I was left with a sneaking suspicion, and this frankly has been my reaction to the whole interprovincial trade dialogue in Canada, that I'm not entirely sure at all what difference it's going to make. Some of these regulatory differences make sense to get rid of. Some of them have a history and a rationale that we kind of sweep under the carpet because we say, well, we got to get rid of red tape and this is somehow going to solve the whole problem. But the idea that this is going to add 3% to our GDP, that we're allowed to sell beer and wine across provincial boundaries is just nonsense. So I understand why political leaders want to look busy at a time like this and show that they're doing something, but let's be realistic about what this really means, because this exclusive focus that just reducing these barriers will suddenly unleash a flood of activity across provinces is nonsense. If we want a flood of activity across provinces, and we need one, then you have to focus on big east-west infrastructure, you have to focus on big investments in other areas, you have to focus on driving growth across the country, and that way people will trade more with each other, because that's how trade happens. Trade is associated with growth, not the other way around for the most part. And we had a tiny bit of discussion about trade promotion at the end of the session, but not enough. So I think, to be frank, I think we've missed in that session and the broader dialogue some of the key issues around interprovincial trade and how to get the most out of it. The climate policy, I was very excited by. I actually found it very, very informative and very encouraging. First of all, it ratified that a global energy transition is occurring, and it's going to keep occurring regardless of what Donald Trump does in the US and what other politicians might do in other jurisdictions. We're going to see the electrification of energy end uses. We're going to double electricity supply and shift to non-emitting sources of electricity. And this is going to keep happening. And this is an enormous economic opportunity. We're going to have to come close to doubling our electricity system in Canada. And we need an industrial policy to make sure that we're part of that global growth and that we get the maximum spin-offs upstream and downstream from our big investments in electrification here. So it was almost a case study in why industrial policy matters. One of the speakers said we should think of it almost, climate and emissions reduction as a North Star guiding principle for shaping and motivating our industrial policies across a whole set of different sectors, not just in the things directly related to electrification, but industries that will depend on electrification to be competitive in a world that's moving to net zero, like chemical industries, green iron and steel, sustainable forestry and the role that it can play as inputs to our affordable housing strategy that we've been talking about, EVs and the supply chain for them, et cetera. And that is going to mean a very different industrial composition, a different industrial makeup for Canada than what we have right now. And this comes back, I think, to the first point I made about industrial policy as a way of thinking. Comparative advantage thinking that we're taught in Economics 101 says do what you do and do more of it and specialize in what you're somehow inherently good at. And we hear that. We've heard that today from folks who say the industries that have net export surpluses in Canada are agriculture and petroleum, so let's do more of that. And this panel came to a very different conclusion, which is we have to do something very different if, in fact, we want to survive in a world that's going to be very different. And I found that very compelling and quite profound. And there's one link, if I can, finally, between the two panels, frankly, because that electrification, the doubling of our electricity supply and shifting to renewables, is going to require enormous investments in interprovincial electricity connectiveness and transmission and other facilities, in part because it makes it more efficient and it allows you to offset the ups and downs that come with renewable energy sources. And believe me, that would add something noticeable to our GDP, a hell of a lot more than how much wine and beer we can cross borders. And if we really want to think about an interprovincial boost, thinking about that east-west infrastructure grid in what is going to be the transcontinental railway of the future or the St. Lawrence Seaway of the future would add 100 times more to GDP than interprovincial barriers, which have been the focus so far.
That's great. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just realized I didn't say a word about the AI session, which was really interesting and facilitated by Ricardo. But it's just to link to the decarbonization. It's also one of the example of a nascent industry where help is needed to develop it. With one challenge that skills and capital is very mobile in that sector, so you can support it, but it's difficult to make sure that they stay. But in the panel, it was really interesting because we heard more enthusiasm than fear about this technology. Two main fear, which is like ethical development of AI and making sure that workers aren't displaced or at least are supported if they are displaced. So we have to keep an eye on that, but more enthusiasm than fear.
And I had the opportunity to pop into a couple sessions, and I think there was an emphasis too from an industrial policy side of things on sovereign data infrastructure, the need for more sovereign data infrastructure. And then Jim, I popped into the interprovincial trade one too, and one of the ideas I heard was Trade Commissioner Service for Interprovincial Trade, which I thought was kind of interesting. You know, we have all this infrastructure for international trade, but we don't have the same infrastructure supporting trade between provinces. And you know, maybe Nova Scotia wants to sell more to Alberta or BC, so that would be interesting. The other thing I want to come back to, though, is so throughout our deliberations for the last couple of years, and we heard some of this morning, we've talked a lot about how industrial policy is done. You know, it's always interesting to talk about where you could apply it, but the how it's done is really important too. So, Glenn, do you think that we need like a complete overhaul of the way industrial policy is done right now in Canada, or is it just sort of tweaks around the edges?
Usually you do an overhaul after you do a thorough diagnosis. So I think you actually start with doing your homework. And the report that you produce is, I think, a really good guide to how to go about that. Can I go through the elements? So I think you start by doing your homework on where the market gaps are, where the needs are. And Jim, we could debate whether there's a market gap or actually an opportunity, but you have to do your homework. Actually, you have to show your work as well. Too much of industrial policy has been done kind of behind a cloak, where you're not really informing the public about why you're doing it. So I think that's where you start. Second, I think you probably want to look at the capacity of your system, of your public service, of your crown entities, also the private sector as a partner, to see where you actually have existing capacities, where you have gaps you have to fill in terms of skills. One of the reasons I think the Indigenous Development Bank didn't advance is because the people who owned it don't have a lot of experience with national development banks. They've been used to program spending as a way to support a community, but they haven't thought about the money multiplier that you get from investing in a bank. It's a very different economic model. You know, writing a check that's spent and gone, as opposed to creating a capital base for a bank that then on lends, it gets repaid and recycles the money for 500 years. Very different model. And so without a public service champion and a ministerial champion, you're not going to move a file forward. So that's often why certain files don't advance and others do. Thirdly, the tools. I'm an old Department of Finance guy. I would prefer not to spend more program money. I would actually rather look for places where there's multiplier effects, where you can have smarter rules. I think the whole debate around procurement is really interesting, where you don't want to lose the competitive opportunity where you're getting the best possible price, but you also want to open the door to more and more Canadian supply opportunities to government. And the PM's kind of opened that door already, talking about more sort of in-Canada procurement. But that's one tool that can be used probably more actively, along with financing, on occasion rules as well. The missing piece for me is evaluation. And that's where I think I kind of said that at every meeting, Rachel, where what about the evaluation of what you're actually doing? It's stunning, you know, as an old Department of Finance guy, it's stunning, Chris, how seldom the tax policy branch actually sets out an evaluation of tax incentives. I mean, that's a really, really good place to start, knowing that a lot of those incentives were put in place for political reasons, not for economic reasons. Maybe they worked, maybe they didn't, but unless you evaluate and share that with the public, you actually don't know what the impact is. Same sort of thing for program spending. One of the things I've done since retiring from the conference board is to do evaluations of banking. So I did the evaluation of EDC, for example. We got a pretty good grade. No, because it's making a lot of money, but it's also growing and providing a lot of service. I supported the federal government reviewing the CIB, and it's also moving in the right direction. So evaluation kind of really helped to educate you about what works, what doesn't, and how to kind of refine practices. Then there's going to be coordination. I think we talk a lot in the report about coordination and actually talking together, learning from each other, making sure programs are actually working, pulling in the same direction. And then ultimately that ends up with accountability and transparency, sharing that with the public. So for me, that's kind of the playlist of what good industrial policy looks like. And if they took your report and just sort of applied it, said to some lucky person, say in PCO, take a look at industrial policy across the board. And I think Doug Nevis has already talked about PCO having a coordinating role going forward. That would allow you to then complete the diagnosis and maybe then do the overhaul.
And that's a great shout out to Doug Nevison, who I think is here. He has a paper coming out with us
he's
in a little
waving in the
bit
back of the
too
room,
that's
but-
on industrial policy evaluation, so stay tuned for that. Jim, I'm going to turn to you. So when we talk about industrial policy, although we have talked a little bit about the relationship with workers today, but often it's in a disconnected conversation from workers and communities. Can you describe how industrial policy connects with workforce and regional strategies?
Sure. I think that one of the more important kind of implicit justifications, and sometimes it's explicit, for a concern with industrial policy is around employment and the nature of jobs that we have, and a kind of general understanding that the sorts of jobs that exist in industries that are supported with industry policy tend to be better than the average jobs, better than jobs that you would see in say, many non-traded service sectors and so on. And this is part of the rationale why we want to get a greater footprint for those industries in Canada than we would have just by private market decisions alone. That is what industrial policy is. So I think part of the mission of industrial policy is precisely to create better jobs in higher productivity, export-oriented, technology-intensive sectors that create the potential for productivity growth and high and rising incomes. So I think there's an inherent link with thinking about labor markets. Now, there's lots of labor market inputs that have to go into industrial policy. We can't be successful in industrial policy if we don't have the skilled workers that we need in order to fill the roles in the industries once they're created. Donald Trump showed us how not to do that the other day when he arrested 700 people from South Korea who were there building a high-tech, value-added auto factory. So the way you want to do it is obviously try to develop your own capacities and skills, make sure that your training pipeline is aligned with where you're going in industrial policy, and make sure also that workers and their unions have a key voice in how industrial policy is designed and implemented.
Well, just one follow-up on that, because a lot of industrial policy involves modernization and investments in automation, which sometimes involve job loss. Can you say a little bit about how to manage kind of an industrial policy that's improving productivity but may actually result in fewer jobs at that plant?
Yeah, that is often posed as a dilemma for labor, and I haven't actually experienced it as too much of a dilemma, to be frank. I worked in the auto industries, for many years, in the aerospace sector, where this happens all the time. Every time a new auto model is assigned to an assembly plant, which has to happen every 5 or 6 or 7 years, or else that assembly plant's going to die. There were shifts in the technology and greater use of robots and more automation, and typically the bargaining unit in that plant would lose 100 or 200 jobs in the course of that model. Now, did that mean the union was going to oppose a new model? Not in a million years, because the whole bargaining unit understood that getting these products, but also the technologies and the productivity results that allowed those plants to compete for and win those products was essential to the viability of the whole facility. So in general, in most of these cases, I don't think that either workers or their unions have made that issue a barrier. There are now, then that raises issues about how you handle the transition, and that was always a big part of those discussions about offering buyouts for senior workers to make sure the junior people didn't get laid off, and making sure that training opportunities were required where new technologies were there. But a smart union can figure that out for sure. So I am not worried about the job loss implications of those new technologies. I want as many of those new technologies as we can possibly get.
Great. I'm going to open it up for questions a little bit, so if people want to start thinking about their questions and getting to the mics, but I'm going to finish with Emna. So I want to draw on your expertise on Quebec. We often, when we talk about industrial policy, we talk about Quebec, both because Quebec's tended to be a little more bold on industrial policy, but also people raise things like Northvolt or Lyon Electric, school buses, those types of things. So can you just say a little bit more about Quebec's experience with industrial policy?
Well, maybe first thing is it's a very interesting time to talk about industrial policy right now in Quebec, because we're kind of at a point where we're assessing 7 years of quite of a bold industrial policy, and just to remember, it's you can't say that in English, but it's a two-leg stool. That won't be very, yeah, 3 legs anyway. So it's a two-part thing. One part is developing the battery sector, and so that is attracting foreign investment, such as Northvolt, but also supporting existing champion like Lion Electric. And the other part is bulking up Investissement Québec. Since 2019, I know you're a big fan of Crown Corporation or Financial Crown Corporation, so.
Properly managed. Yeah.
And I think it is, but so it bulking up Investissement Québec. So that was the kind of the two-part project, and actually both are under fire right now. No pun intended, if you've seen the video, but it's really criticized, but I think it really highlights some of the opportunities and challenges related to industrial policy that we've studied in our report. Maybe starting with the risks, I think it shows the risk, the political risk at least, to choosing the winner. So Northvolt is the main example, and the government is trying to explain that it's kind of, how do you say, coup de circuit. So it's like a home run strategy. So hopefully we try with some companies, and some of them are going to be champions, and it's going to be great, and it's worth having some losses just in case we're able to attract a real champion. And we need it because we need to diversify and create new, to be present in new markets such as the battery sector. So I think it does make sense, but it shows the political risk, because now we're going to be way more risk averse into going and supporting industries. It also shows the risk of not letting the loser lose. And so with Lion Electric, that's what we're seeing is we've supported that business that was a champion in Quebec, but right now went underwater, and here again we're going to be way more risk averse. But it also showed the risk about evaluation. So for example, Investissement Québec right now is under scrutiny because of their return, but at the same time we ask of the organization to both work as a bank and so have good returns, but at the same time also support strategic sector. So I think evaluation is good, but the devil is in the details in terms of how we evaluate our programs and our strategies.
Well, and that's always the challenge with the public sector financial institution, understanding that you may have a commercial mandate, but you have a public policy purpose, and how to do evaluation that actually kind of evaluates both parts in tandem. Maybe on occasion accepting a lower return if you have a high public policy concern, if you can build new industries, if you can create new employment, high value employment. So that should be kind of given a credit as well as a financial return.
Exactly, but it's a bit more complicated than just a quarter report number that you can show. So yeah. I think it shows that challenge, but I think it also shows some opportunities that we can, or inspiration that we can draw from. The fact that Investissement Québec became kind of a one-stop shop for businesses, so it's both access to capital, but also support for exportation. They've also integrated like even industrial labs to integrate new technologies. And so it's an interesting, I think, approach to industrial policy, because it gives, we know that right now the challenge is not only access to capital, but also just the capacity. So having the human resources, the labor that you need to, the energy. And so having one-stop shop, I think we should keep an eye on how they do. And also, I think one of the interesting opportunity that we see is that they are working, it's still not perfect, but they're working in integrating indicators that are above creating jobs. So the idea of like we want to attract this business because it increases productivity, is going to place us in a higher value chain. But we see that it's difficult also to summarize it in one indicator.
That was really interesting. So we're open for questions. If people want to have a last word, comment, question, Senator, open to you.
I'll always take a free moment to jump up. Thank you, Rachel, just thank you for alerting me to this conference. Really grateful to be here. It's been a great day. I'm really looking at the monopoly of government and how we better manage the fact that government is a monopoly. And the great thing about competition, and I saw Brad here, I don't know if he's still here from the Competition Bureau, but the importance of competition is that it drives competitiveness. And out of that, you get appropriateness of delivery, effectiveness, and cost efficiency automatically being pulled along as benefits in terms of evaluation. And how do we start to drive that into our government so that we start to have, I think, a better understanding of the appropriateness, effectiveness, and cost efficiency of various programs? We improve programs by taking the existing base of that program and incrementally improving off of it when the existing base may be totally irrelevant and totally demonstrative of incompetence. I mean, we've got to somehow change that culturally. Just wondering what thoughts you might have.
Anyone want to take that one? Glenn?
Well, I guess I would start. First of all, I think Chris said this earlier. By its nature, government is a monopoly. Like, you can't have two defense departments. God knows you don't want two finance departments. So can you find a substitute or something which is a kind of a synthetic response? I think events like this are part of the synthetic response. Independent organizations that evaluate overall government practices, put out a public report, have ongoing discussion of it. The same thing can happen in-house within government. You have evaluation. One of the big bugbears is we don't share the results of the evaluations with the public. So I think more transparency is a good substitute, because you're not going to get the pure competition forces. Within government programs, though, on something like procurement, I would not want to go to a Canada-only procurement model, which would end up being less effective, less efficient, more expensive. But you can also have carve-outs and even have competitive forces at work where you're keeping track maybe of the volume of Canadian contracts won, but also taking the advantage of international competition and the advantage that can throw through government. So that's kind of my response, is that you're not going to get, I know that you have a huge interest, for example, in competition in the financial services industry. And carry on, Senator. I think you're doing good stuff there. But within government itself, it's really hard to look for competitive forces, but you can then look for proxies which would help to kind of serve the same purpose. And research and transparency are one way to actually make progress.
Yeah, and one of the things that we call for in the report is having standardized metrics where you could assess, for example, a tax credit against a grant program and evaluate them on the same foundation. Yeah. Jim, Emna, anything to add?
I think one conversation that we had with the committee was also a lot of government capacity. So when we're thinking about a new program, a new subsidy, a new big thing, we have to think about how we're able to actually deliver on that. And even without competitive forces, we as citizens and businesses, we can expect results from our government and in their core mandate, delivering permit, administrating programs. That is something that I think we should expect, and it's something that has to be taken into account before launching a new project or program.
Jim, anything to add on that? Okay. Well, since there's no more questions, I'm going to use that opportunity. I understand that we now have a date for the federal budget. Yes. November 4th, I think. If you could suggest one thing from what you heard today or our deliberations on industrial policy for the federal budget, what would it be? Jim?
Well, suggesting one thing sort of goes against the grain of what I said at the very outset, which is industrial policy is not one big thing. It's a way of thinking and a way of working. That being said, obviously, particularly in a budget, you have choices that you have to make. One that I hope is that is high on the list and on the agenda for the government is the challenge to our existing value-added industries arising from Trump's trade war. And it isn't an accident that he's giving us CUSMA exclusions to keep exporting a lot of the raw materials and intermediate products to the U.S., but his 232 tariffs are focused squarely on the most important and successful high-value, high-tech industries that we've built through industrial policy, by the way. So that's auto, steel, aluminum, copper, forestry, and now we can expect aerospace, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and more. So in this regard, those industries are going to need help to survive Trump. And you know, we got a lot to do in Canada to make the overall economy more resilient, but letting those industries die, letting plants close, letting companies leave will be a body blow that will be very hard to recover from. So the government announced September 5th a strategic response fund, I think it's called, if I've got the acronym right, $5 billion. That's obviously an important sign of commitment to those industries, but as Trump unrolls more 232 tariffs, frankly, that number is going to have to get bigger. And in the context of, you know, I won't say austerity budget, I'm not sure it will be an austerity budget, but a budget that's making hard choices, making sure that those success stories from our industrial policy history are still here, has to be near the top of that list.
Emna, how about you?
I'm going to be looking at infrastructure investment. Above the 5 big projects, we need a bit more visibility what's coming in the next 10 years in terms of infrastructure development. We've seen that it's the core economic mandate of a government. Make sure that we have good infrastructure.
Glenn?
I truly get the last word. Wow. I should probably pay for that. So I was at EDC for 10 years, so I could say trade diversification, but I think that's actually pretty well in hand. I think the guys at Global Affairs understand what we need to do. We've already had a strategy for about a decade, or even 20 years, to diversify. We just have to put them on steroids. I don't know enough about defense, but I would be tempted to say rebuild our procurement capacity there. But I'm going to go with what was on the top of the list in the report, which is creating an Indigenous Development Bank. The idea is there, it's ripe, it's ready to go, and it could really, I believe, help economic reconciliation get pushed across the line. So that's where I would start.
I really like that we finished on that, you know, because we've had Indigenous economic reconciliation as a theme throughout this whole process, and listen to Glenn. It's a great recommendation. Always listen to Glenn. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up things here before I pass it on to a very special guest. But I want to say a few words of thanks to start. First, to our sponsors. Thank you to all of those who generously supported this research project and this conference. Second, I really want to thank all of our moderators and speakers. This day has been so rich and engaging, and much more than I ever could have imagined. You know, Noah's fascinating presentation this morning, all the way to this very thoughtful discussion. So third, I really need to thank the IRPP staff. As many of you who have organized conferences know, it is a lot of work. And we definitely could not have done it without our events coordinator extraordinaire, Blair Elliott. I don't know, Blair's in the room. She's probably... And thanks as well to all the many staff that are working hard behind the scenes. We've got Abigail and Dana and Elisa and Natalia, Shaima, Catherine's here, Tim. And of course, thanks to some of the staff that you have seen on stage as well. Steve Lafleur, who led this project for the last couple of years, and Charles Breton, Ricardo Chefik, and of course, our president and CEO, Jennifer Ditchburn. And finally, last but not least, a very huge thank you to our steering group members, Lise Birkendavi, Emna Braham, Glenn Hodgson, Jesse McCormick, Chris Reagan, and Jim Stanford. When we started this journey 2 years ago, we hoped that bringing together a smart group of people with different perspectives would help to create a more meaningful national dialogue on industrial policy. And you have far exceeded my expectations. So thank you. And I now have the pleasure of introducing a very special guest, Parliamentary Secretary Nur Mohammed. He is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation. Mr. Nur Mohammed represents the riding of Vancouver-Granville, a riding he has held since 2021. He previously held the position of Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage. Prior to his life in politics, he was a successful technology entrepreneur and held senior executive roles with a number of global technology companies, helped launch and build innovative businesses, and advised up-and-coming startups. Mr. Nur Mohammed completed his undergraduate degree at Princeton, his master's degree at Harvard, and attended Oxford University as a Commonwealth Scholar for his doctoral studies. He is a former governor of the Confederation Centre of the Arts and has served on the boards of Covenant House, Vancouver, and the Lionsgate Hospital Foundation. He has been awarded the Hellenic Community Lifetime Achievement Award, Governor General's Caring Canadian Award, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. Please join me in welcoming Parliamentary Secretary Nur Mohammed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I mean, the thing that you missed, which is I think the most important job, is I'm the dad to 2 boys who keep life very interesting and are actually part of my thinking as I think about what you guys have been talking about today, because it's going to be our kids and our grandkids that are going to inherit whatever we do right or wrong right now in the context of building industrial policy and building an economy for the future for this country. You've heard from the best of the best, and Jennifer never does anything halfway, and you've had an incredible day of really, really smart people who have probably shared with you far more intelligent things than I can share. But I would sort of offer you a couple of thoughts, and I understand Premier Simpson probably also covered some of this when he was talking, but when you think about this moment, where we find ourselves today, there's a couple of things, and I am going to talk about AI because that's my day job. But Jennifer said, feel free to talk broadly as well. What I would say is this: we find ourselves at a really interesting point, and you are listening to and engaging with people every single day in your respective lives. There is a sense of fear, there's a sense of uncertainty, there is a sense of we haven't lived this before in our lifetimes. What comes next when it comes to thinking about how Canada's economy is going to evolve over the next number of years and decades, and also the impact that it's going to have on people, their jobs, their families, their communities. And I would say this: the road that I think our government and I think Canadians would like to go down and should go down is in seeing this moment as a profound opportunity for Canada. It's a profound opportunity for Canada to invest in building a strong, long-term foundation for industry in this country, for building capacity in this country, for building the infrastructure. We heard infrastructure a second ago, the infrastructure that is required to sustain that capacity, and to build the relationships globally that enable us to be successful. Now, Canada, as you will have probably heard from any number of people, has more free trade agreements with more G20 countries than any other G20 country. We've never had to use those relationships. We've never had to use them because we've always had the US. But what this moment presents us is the opportunity to say, how do we now leverage the work that we have already done in those trade agreements, in those relationships? But it also allows us to take advantage of, in my view, our strongest asset right now, which is the intellectual capital of people who have come to this country over generations, and First Nations communities who have always been here, with connections around the world, right? We have managed in this country successfully to use, diversity has become a bad word, but to use that diversity as a way to bolster who we are and how we can build relationships, economic relationships with the rest of the world. That is a competitive advantage that this country has. We have to choose to use it. But you can only choose to use it if you also have the stuff to go along with it. And that's what we've been talking about, right? How do you build the stuff that is now required? So you heard about the Major Projects Office, 5 major, and then a 6th project in British Columbia just announced yesterday. These are big steps. They're not the only steps, they are the beginning. You've also got money going into infrastructure in a substantial way. Housing is a starting point. But you've also got now to think about how we invest in intellectual capital. So now here to AI. Canada has been, when you talk about AI, digital, and quantum, Canada has been at the leading edge of AI and quantum. We have a choice that we need to make now, and that choice is, do we hold on to that role by building the right relationships, by investing the right money in the right places, by backing Canadian winners? Or do we do what has historically been Canada's position, which is say we're going to seed and nurture really great research and let others take over from here? And our view is that this is the time to now keep this stuff in Canada, to build it in Canada, to invest in those things in this country, and to make sure that Canadian researchers, Canadian academics, Canadian entrepreneurs can work together to build those industries here in Canada. And so that's the work that we have been doing over the course of the last little while. Our job is to make sure that as uncertainty continues to prevail south of the border, when it comes to digital infrastructure, when it comes to the Prime Minister talked about sovereign cloud the other day, when you talk about building a sovereign cloud, when you talk about building sovereign compute capacity, this is critical to making sure that Canadians are safe at home, making sure that our partners can rely on what information they give us. In a world where knowledge and information is the most important commodity, it allows us to have a competitive advantage and a security advantage over many, many other countries. But that's going to take work. It's going to take work from government, investing in winners, which is, some would say, an un-Canadian way to look at things. But we are going to start investing in winners. We're going to work with those players, and we're going to make sure that Canadian capacity stays Canadian. It's about making sure that we are retooling and reskilling workers who are going to see changes in their lives. And we announced a $9 million package in Alberta just last week to help retrain workers in the oil patch so that they can find new ways of adapting. But that has to be part of the conversation. We can't pretend that things are not going to change. They are changing for workers, for industry, in manufacturing, in natural resources, in healthcare. We have to choose to look at it as opportunity rather than fear. And if Canadians and Canadian academics and Canadian researchers and Canadian businesses say, look, we're going to work together to figure out how we make this a cornerstone of the approach we're going to take to the future, then it becomes opportunity for us. And so when we look at the what of what we are building, whether it's better roads, better factories, more efficient hospitals, better cloud, more efficient compute, that capacity, that intellectual capacity lives in this country, it resides in this country, or most interestingly, it wants to come to this country from other places. And so if we can build an ecosystem in this country that enables that type of innovation to occur, we can win. We can win not just the current moment of how do we deal with the uncertainty the Trump administration presents us, but we can win the idea and the reality of a country that is set up for long-term success, that can bolster, that can be buffeted against changes in the way in which our partners around the world, 1 or 2 or 3, may change how they want to engage with the world, because we have thought about doing this in a fashion that allows us to engage with the world writ large, not just with 1 or 2 or 3 key players. But it requires us to make investments, right? We've already announced that we've invested in building a new port in Delta in British Columbia. Making sure that the infrastructure to get to that port is going to be a critical concern. We've announced that we're going to take advantage of our LNG capacity in this country. We've talked about how we're going to lead into nuclear. All of these things demand of us then to say, what next? It's not just these projects happen, now what? How do we use these projects as an opportunity to not just buy Canadian, but to build Canadian capacity? How do we look at best-in-class methods, best-in-class ways of building, best-in-class ways of delivering these projects, and nurture that capacity in Canada so that when we talk about industrial policy in this country, it's not theoretical, it is practical in its application to how we build new things, how we invest in things, how we create the intellectual horsepower in this country to be able to deploy and then to take that capacity globally, right? If we can design, deliver, discover, and then nurture best-in-class capacity in this country, that becomes another commodity that we can export. So I think our opportunity as government in this moment is to say to Canadians and to say to all of you who are on the front line of so much of the very heavy lifting that has to be done, that says, we're going to see this as an opportunity, but we have to work together. We have to be willing to take some substantial, intelligent, managed risk in where we are putting our money, in how we are making difficult decisions on the projects that we want to fund, but that we are making sure that there is a path to bringing people along on that journey so that the businesses of today and the businesses of tomorrow in this country can see a remarkable path of economic success. This isn't just, you know, when we say it, like we've turned 13 economies into one. I mean, that's great, but what does it actually mean? It means that we can now trade across this country. But it's more than that, right? It's about saying, how do we now take talent and capacity from across this country and work across jurisdictions to put up the best possible option for other countries and other jurisdictions when they're saying, we want to build X or Y, and they can say, look to Canada because they figured out how to do this. Let's get Canadian talent, expertise, commodities, and goods to help us on that journey. Right? So that is part of this, right? It is not an end unto itself. It is the means to a much broader end, which is to say that if we build a strong economy in this country, where we can connect the pieces, very divergent pieces, from across this country, across supply chain, across commodity extraction, across construction, across project development, across intellectual capital, in AI and in quantum, you then have the ability to compete with anybody else around the world. You can compete with Japan, you can compete with China, you can compete with the United States. You're not going to win on every single front, but if we are careful and methodical and we focus our attention where we know we can be strong, there is an advantage to being Canadian. People want to work with us. People want to deal with us. People trust us. And so that is, I think, where the opportunity meets the moment. And so I would conclude by saying this. This is a complicated, challenging time. It is a moment that all of us are trying to figure out how to navigate as things change quite literally daily. But if we focus on our, you can control the controllables, right? What can we control? The thing that we can control is our willingness and our capacity to work together. And if we all see this as a moment where academia, the private sector, government work together across whatever differences there may be to say, this is how we are going to establish and then place our bets on Canada, on Canadian businesses, on Canadian innovation. If we can do that, I would submit, I think the policy possibilities are endless. And when you're doing this again in a year or 2 years or 3 years, I hope that you'll have me back and you'll be able to say, you know what, there was some truth in what you said. But it comes down to one thing. And that is a fundamental belief in what minds in this country, and I'm just talking about, you say a fundamental belief in Canada, the fundamental belief in the intellectual horsepower of Canadians and our ability to actually do the thing that we aren't always that good at, which is translating that horsepower into really strong outcomes on the ground, whether in the form of taking innovation that is happening and commercializing it, whether it is taking the best in building and other types of technology we develop in this country and taking it to market in a way that we are sometimes afraid to do, and not being afraid. Sometimes Canadian humility needs to be replaced with Canadian pride. And doing that in a way that is uniquely Canadian, I think, is going to build a remarkably strong economic engine in this country that is going to be the foundation of the economy and the industry of the future in this country. So thank you for the work that all of you do. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to reading more of your deliberations. Thank you.